In a time when college football may be losing some national popularity and a lot of criticism focusing on the elite locking down college football, this is a program, this is a story, this is a situation that makes people feel good. Definitely a feel-good story in college football. Iowa State's ascension to the top of the Big 12. We got Levi Stevenson on the line from Wide Right Natty Light. It's the SB Nation platform for the Cyclones. Levi, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's always a good day to be a Cyclone, especially good right now.
I like that motto. It's
Yeah.
good stuff. Well, this football program, before we dive into the personnel breakdown of this 21 roster, you've got to be elated. I know that you wanted a Big 12 championship and you came about 30 yards shy of one, or maybe an ill-advised pass down the right sideline late in that game in a comeback effort against Oklahoma. And the Sooners still own the conference. But my goodness, everybody is raving about Iowa State and the job that Matt Campbell has done. And we've had you on in previous seasons in which I know one of my questions to you was, Campbell's done a great job lifting this from 2-10, 3-9 to 7-5, 8-4. But taking that next step, then you start to have to really knock off consistently some really, top 15 to 25 teams in the country. Can they do that? Right. Because there was about a 3-season stint there where they kind of stalled at that or leveled off at that 7 to 8 win range. But it seems as though Campbell's been able to break through that.
Well, and part of the thing you got to remember too, though, is that 3-season kind of stall out at eight wins. You got to remember it came after. I mean, that was his second, third, and fourth seasons with the program. So it's not like he'd been here for 10 years and then stalled out so much as that, because you have there's a thing that Iowa State fans found out when we played Notre Dame in the Camping World Bowl a couple of years ago, or two Decembers ago, is that the difference between 4 or 5 wins and 7 and 8 wins is a lot smaller than the gap between 8 wins and 10 wins. There's the what you have to do to go from 8 to 10 wins, or 8 to 11 wins, or 9 to 11 wins, or whatever it is. That gap, it only seems like 1 or 2 wins, but what you have to do to bridge that gap is so much more than going from 4 to 8 wins or 4 to 7 wins or whatever it is. So Iowa State, through virtue of a couple good hits in recruiting and just being a better team, if it just to oversimplify, executing better, not turning the ball over as much, doing kind of the basic, the fundamentals well, that can take you from 4-8 to 8-4. But to go from 8-4 up to getting 9 or 10 wins, that's a different ball game, and that's what Iowa State found out against Notre Dame. Because Notre Dame, even though that year they were, maybe you could call them maybe a tad down that year, I think they were still a 10-win team or something like that going into that game. But Notre Dame, especially recruits, but and where they really shine is their offensive line and defensive line. They're really, really, really good in the trenches. And what Iowa State found out is that you can have really, really great skill talent on the outside. You can have a quarterback and a running back that can compete with anybody. But if you can't play down low in the trenches, you're going to get blown out by the really good teams that can do both, that have really good skill talent and have very, very good offensive and defensive lines. So one of the things that Iowa State did to take that next step forward was, as the kind of the rumor or the story goes or whatever, is basically as soon as they got back in Ames, Matt Campbell fired the strength and condition coach and hired in Dave Andrews from Pittsburgh, with the specific intention. This would have been last January when they got off the plane back from Orlando. And since then, I mean, you saw, we could see it this past offseason. Iowa State's offensive line was very good. They were really good. They gave Breece Hall a lot of running room. They kept Brock Purdy off his butt. And he was the least sacked quarterback in certainly the Big 12, and maybe one of the least sacked quarterbacks in the country. I mean, he didn't have to deal with it very much. And part of that is virtue of the offensive line, virtue of the offensive scheme and getting the ball out of his hands quickly and all that kind of. But, when you have one of the least sacked quarterbacks in college football, pair that up with one of the nation's leading rushers, the offensive line is doing something right. And they're doing something right against some good defensive lines like Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and West Virginia. So you're seeing Iowa State is using that to punch through. They're using the offensive line and the defensive line to really push them up above that 8-win mark, so they can get into the 9, 10, 11 win category and really start pushing for conference championships, playoff appearances.
So, Levi, let's start right there. I rarely go with the offensive line to start out the personnel conversation, but you took us there, and it draws me back to conversations we've had in the past where we have discussed the offensive line and that being key to the development of the entire program.
Right.
So how does the personnel stack up for 21?
Well, coming back, you have four of your five original starters coming back. Now, Trevor Downing was a starter to begin the season, but was hurt most of the season. He played the first game. He got hurt during the first game against Louisiana, and then didn't play the rest of the season. Though the offensive line still performed well without him, he's still objectively the best. Maybe aside for Colin Newell, the center, Trevor Downing, he's probably the best lineman in the entire group. So you'll have him back. You'll have Colin Newell back. You'll have basically your original starters from last year. So you have Joey Ramos probably on one side, and maybe for that other tackle spot, maybe Jake Remsburg, who played quite a bit last season, could see Grant Traber. Any one of those guys. That offensive line room is very deep now. They've got lots of really good young guys. They're going to be good for a while. Trevor Downing is he'd be a redshirt sophomore since they would have redshirted him last year. He'd be a redshirt sophomore coming in. He's already played a bunch of games. That offensive line is, it's going to be very good next year. It's going to be every bit as good as it was last year. It should be, I should say. And they've got pretty much everybody back from a group that led, that ran in front, that would helped Breece Hall become one of the nation's leading rushers, and Brock Purdy, one of the least sacked quarterbacks in the country.
So, Levi, it doesn't appear, based on what you've just run down, that two of your top recruits in the 21 class, Tyler Morrow and Jim Boniface, are going to be necessarily needed this fall.
They won't play. I would be it would take a catastrophic number of injuries for those guys to play. And that's good, because those are good recruits. Those are good offensive line recruits for Iowa State. And recruits that under Paul Rhodes may play really early in their career. Right now, they don't need to. You can sit a guy out. You can just plunk him down on the redshirt list and be totally fine with it, and you're not going to worry about it at all. So those guys, I would be outside of garbage time and using their 4 redshirt games, I would be very, very surprised if either of them played this fall.
Seneca Wallace comes to mind. Alan Lazard comes to mind as being national stars at Iowa State.
Yep.
And those meaning national stars for people that follow college football.
They're popping up on the radar across the country as opposed to just the big 12.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Breece Hall may have broken into that stratosphere of the guy that just your typical sports fan knows, that's really not locked into college football, just watches the big games. Breece Hall's that good, and finally has gotten the acclaim and is still receiving the acclaim after 21 touchdowns, 23 touchdowns total, 23 catches.
Unanimous All-American.
In a 14-game season in which he would have played with the conference championship game and the postseason game in a regular season. You're talking about pushing 2,000 yards of total offense. What can you say about this guy that hasn't been said?
He's really special. He's the interesting, so before this we had Dave Montgomery. So Dave Montgomery was kind of just right below the level star you were talking about, where people that pay attention to college football knew who Dave Montgomery was. But if you were just a casual fan, you might not. Where Breece Hall is starting to bust through that a little bit. Breece Hall has a lot of the same skill sets that Dave and really just otherworldly vision. He's really tough to bring down. He's a good runner. But what Breece Hall has that Dave Montgomery didn't have, or at least didn't have until apparently this past season with the Bears, is he didn't really have the top end speed that you need to really bust off the long runs, where David would get 25, 30-yard runs and then kind of get forced out of bounds or get caught from behind or whatever it is. Breece doesn't get caught from behind anymore. He led the country last year in 50-plus yard touchdown runs. And when you have Iowa State, when you have a quarterback like Brock Purdy, you have all those tight ends, you have the receiver, you have a line that's doing a really good job, but then you also have one of the most talented backs in college football that you can pair up with that. That's really difficult to stop, especially when you have an offense like Iowa State's that it doesn't really try to do anything super. It doesn't try to do anything cute. Doesn't do anything kind of weird. They kind of take a pseudo, like a kind of a hybrid of a Big 10/Big 12 approach to this, where they're going to try to beat you. Like Iowa State knows what they're good at, and they're just going to beat you with it. Kind of like Kansas State did for a long time under Bill Snyder. Everybody knows what Kansas State's what we're going to do. They were going to run the ball. And they were going to get a few deep passes here and there, but they were going to run lots of option with the quarterback, things like that. And everybody knew it, but nobody could stop them because they were really, really good at executing. And that's what Iowa State's doing. If you watch Iowa State week in and week out, you can pretty much kind of predict what they're going to do on a lot of plays. If it's 3rd and 6, they're probably throwing a stick route to Charlie Kohler. That's just what's going to happen. If it's 3rd and 2, they are giving it to Breece Hall in an inside zone. And I would say just dares them to beat them. They dare the other team to out execute them. And it's really entertaining to watch because they're not doing it through any sort of like weird offensive scheme like Coastal Carolina did. That's not to discredit Coastal Carolina because it's still a good team. But part of their magic and part of the reason they caught a lot of people off guard is because their offensive system is kind of weird and it's unusual to defend. It doesn't show up like anywhere else. So they have something that other people don't. Whereas Iowa State doesn't really have anything that nobody else has. Aside from maybe kind of this combination of talent everywhere. Especially at the tight end spot, but they out execute people. They don't turn the ball over. They've been one of the least penalized teams in college football for the last 5 or 6 years. They really generally don't beat themselves. So it's a really interesting thing to watch. And Breece Hall is part of that. If you watch him in any of the games this year, there was times where the tight ends, the wide receiver, Xavier Hutchinson has a good game. Who do they go back to when they need a touchdown, when it's 3rd and 2 on the, it's 3rd and 2 next to the goal line? Who are they going to go to? Who are they going to give the ball to? Breece Hall every time. And he punched it in every time.
It can never be predicted that a guy's going to turn out to be as great a player as Breece Hall, unless maybe he's a 5-star and he's the top guy on the board. But typically those guys don't even turn out to be anything close to this.
Right.
There's a question coming in regarding Breece Hall's recruitment. And he was 22nd rated at the running back position in his class coming out of Kansas. He was a 4-star, which typically Iowa State doesn't bring in the 4-stars for as good as they are right now and is nationally acclaimed. There are no 4-stars in the current recruiting class. Right. So do you remember the recruitment of Breece Hall and how that came about and why they were able to reel him in?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one. He had a pretty good offer list. I'd have to look exactly who they all had offers from, but towards the end, really the two of the bigger schools that it came down to was us and Iowa, just like it was with Jarrell Brock. The other borderline 4-star running back from that class that Iowa State pulled in. At one point in time, they were both ranked in the top 10 of their position. I think the final rankings, they slid down. But when they committed, they were both in the top 10 running backs for their class. And there's an infamous photo that has circulated the Iowa State Twitter sphere of Breece Hall in an Iowa uniform on his recruiting visit. So, it came down to that. And I know like our friends at Kansas State, because he came out of Wichita. So I know our friends at Kansas State were kicking themselves for not going after him a little bit harder. But Breece Hall, it was kind of an interesting one. It was a fairly quiet recruitment. There wasn't like anything I remember as far as like really tough battles coming down to the end for him. It seemed like Iowa State kind of had a lead early on and just kind of kept working it, and it ended up working out all right. Because he's a kid that fits Matt Campbell's culture and his system perfectly. Guy that's really good between the tackles. Obviously, his vision, he's got the speed to push it outside, but then his off the field stuff too. I mean, if you listen to the guy speak at all, I mean, he's Matt Campbell and a running back, and that's exactly what you want. You want continuity within your program culture, which is what Matt Campbell has worked very, very hard to build. And it's worked out, and Breece Hall is a manifestation of that, just like his predecessor, Dave Montgomery.
Talking Iowa State football, getting you set for the Cyclones spring practice. We got Levi Stevenson on the line. You can hear the obvious insight and knowledge into Iowa State football. So catch him and the rest of the staff there at Wide Right Natty Light on SB Nation's platform for ISU. And of course, lock it in here at the Voice of College Football, where we talk up the game we love each and every day. Brock Purdy's a guy that's gained a wealth of experience. It seems like he's been there forever at this point. Yeah. Almost a 67% passer last year, 19 touchdowns and 9 picks. Is there more ceiling space for him to reach?
Oh, most certainly. Especially if you watch the early part of the season, Brock Purdy really wasn't that great. He was treading water for the first few. He was downright bad against Louisiana. TCU was a little bit better. Pretty efficient, had the worst turnover in the history of sports. If you want to see it, he got sacked and then inexplicably in the middle of the sack, he was trying to throw it away, but ended up essentially throwing it up in the air backwards, and the TCU defender caught it and ran it in for like a 10-yard touchdown. It was the worst turnover I've ever. We don't have to rehash it. It's just
okay. I'm jotting it down because I'm going to go look it up.
I'm sure you can do it on your own time. I don't need to see it again. But the worst turnover maybe I've ever seen in a college football game. Other than that, if not for that awful turnover, generally pretty efficient. Oklahoma, the Oklahoma game, he only completed like 50% of his passes. Now that doesn't really tell the whole story. He kind of, it was one of those games where he just kind of made the plays that needed to be made to win. It was kind of the winner quarterback as opposed to the really good efficient stat guy. He's just a guy that he was Shane Falco from the Replacements, just kind of making the plays that he needed to make to win. And then as he kind of grew on a little bit, he was really up and down, up through then you get to the Baylor game. He throws 3 interceptions in the first half, and I would say Twitter, nobody was like, you need to bench this guy now, but there was some rumblings like, man, I don't know, something's not right. And then switch flips at halftime, and all of a sudden he's Tom Brady, and he's going out there and he's doing everything he needs to do. And Iowa State comes back, they win that game, and then they go on this tear. The next week they beat Kansas State 45-0. And then they beat West Virginia 42-6. And then they go down to Texas, and they beat Texas in Austin. And then they come back. It was Kansas State, then Texas, then West Virginia, I should say. 45-0 Kansas State, go down to Austin, beat Texas at their place, and then come back and beat West Virginia 42-6 and make it to the Big 12 title game. And the whole team especially, but Brock Purdy in particular was really, really good down that stretch. And down that stretch, we saw what Brock Purdy can be. We saw what really good Brock Purdy is. In the context of that team, it was, make your good throws, make good decisions to your tight ends, to your receivers, don't turn it over, and give the ball to Brees. That's what he needs to do. Brock Purdy is he's a very good player. If Iowa State needs to lean on Brock Purdy, they can. He's perfectly capable of leading a team to victories, just like he did his freshman season, where there were some times where he just gutted them out. Same way in 2019 as well. So he can be a guy that they can lean on, but they don't have to. When you have Breece Hall in a really good offensive line, you don't have to lean on Brock Purdy. So what that does is it gives him an opportunity to be really efficient, make good decisions, and don't turn the ball over. And that's really all he's got to do. So there's a lot more ceiling. If you can get, the second half of Baylor / Kansas State Brock Purdy for an entire season, I mean, you're talking about a French Heisman candidate there. I mean, he's really, really good he's just got to be more consistent about making good decisions.
And talk about really good and talking about really consistent, Charlie Kolar has seemingly been one of the best tight ends in college football, if not the best. And it seems like he's had like an NFL career because, again, it seems like it's been like 5 or 6 years that he's been talked about amongst the best tight ends in college football. He caught a 44 last year, 7 touchdowns. Xavier Hutchinson had the big numbers with 64 catches. And I'm looking at a list of 7 guys who caught at least 15 passes last year.
Mm-hmm. They spread it around. And the amazing thing too is that you're talking about these guys have been here forever. Brock Purdy, technically because of the COVID year, is still a true junior. Charlie Kolar is still a redshirt junior. Breece Hall is still technically a true sophomore. I mean, I don't think I would guess a lot of these guys will probably leave after this season, since they have a lot of them will have opportunities at the really high, at the NFL basically, especially Breece Hall, because he's, 3rd-year running back. That's, if you have a chance to go in the first couple rounds as a running back, you go. But you're totally right that Charlie Kolar's been around forever. And like I mentioned before, is that Iowa State doesn't hide what they do. They're really good with their tight ends, and they use them a lot. And they know that there are very few people in the Big 12 and in college football that can guard Charlie Kolar. I mean, you can stay with him. He's not like supremely athletic like a Kyle Pitts, where he's just running past people. But he has an ability to box people out and to reel in, especially like the 3rd and 6 stick routes on 3rd and 6 to pick up first downs. If you throw the ball 7 feet in the air, Charlie Kolar is coming down with it, whether you like it or not. And if you don't, and you still try to pass interfere him, still probably going to reel it in because he's huge and he has really, really good hands and is an exceptional route runner. But the best part about what makes Iowa State dangerous is not just Charlie Kolar, not just Breece Hall, not just Brock Purdy, but you have those guys in tandem. And then you had, like you mentioned, Xavier Hutchinson too, who really came on the scene. I think he's primed for a really big season next year. And we can talk about him in a little bit too. But there's not just one tight end at Iowa State. There's 3 of them. Well, last year there was 3, and then there will be, Charlie Kohler and Chase Allen are both back. And now you'll have a third one that'll slide into that F role, whether it's Jared Roos or it's an H back. Some teams call it an H back. Iowa State calls it an F. Could be Jared Roos, could be Deshaun Hanukkah, could be Easton Dean, who we've heard raving from on the coaching staff is Easton Dean. He was a quarterback recruit out of Kansas and came here, and depth chart got pretty full pretty quick. So he converted to tight end. And now we're hearing from the coaching staff that he could be better than Charlie and Chase. And so, that's what they think. And they were, and it was funny because when we first heard reports about Breece Hall in camp before his freshman season, we were hearing reports of like Breece could be better than Troy Davis, which if anybody is old enough to remember Troy Davis, he was really, really good. First running back to ever run for 2,000 yards in back-to-back seasons, Heisman runner up. Well, his 5th place is his sophomore year, and 2nd place is junior year to Danny Werfel. Somehow still didn't win the Doak Walker that year. Don't know if we'll ever get the answer to that one, but I digress. But they were saying they thought he could be better than Troy. And so far, I mean, he's not going to put the yards up that Troy did because he's not going to get 45 carries a game, but he looks the part. He looks every bit as good as Troy, if not better. And I mean, if you ask a lot of Iowa State fans if they'd rather have Troy or Breece Hall right now, most of them would tell you Breece Hall. So their talent evaluation has been very, very good since they've been here. Their talent evaluation has been exceptional. Between finding Dave Montgomery, he was a low 3-star guy, finding Mike Rose out in the middle of Ohio someplace, and you got Breece Hall. And this is kind of Iowa State didn't end up with him. But Matt Campbell actually extended an offer to eventual 5-star quarterback in Michigan recruit. Is it JJ McCarthy? Yes. Iowa State offered him back in like 8th grade or something like that. I mean, the eye for talent that Matt Campbell has is really exceptional. And if he's telling me that Easton Dean's got a chance to be better than Charlie Kohler and Chase Allen, then I'm fully on board and I'm ready. And I say, I don't know if anybody here is a religious person, but if you want to say a prayer for the rest of the Big 12 linebackers that have to cover that guy, I don't, they could probably use it.